Hey, good morning, everyone. I thought I would put up a quick Chapter 7 summary, Capacity to Contract. Important chapter. It really befuddles a few students or confuses a few over this concept of voidable contracts. A voidable contract is a valid contract until one or both of the parties might exercise of what we call a right of rescission or disaffirmance. Legal terms, I wish they would be more simplistic because the concepts aren't that difficult to understand. Sometimes language intimidates us. But think about it. There are times when contracts, the law is going to provide, that shouldn't be enforceable if one of the parties elects to get out of it. Why should a party be able to elect to get out of it? Well, when we go over these principles, you'll see that the law is trying to create sets of fairness rules in light of sometimes lack of capacity or lack of voluntariness or lack of true intent because of duress or undue influence or fraud. But in Chapter 7, it's about capacity to contract, and it starts right off with minors. A minor is anybody under the age of 17 in most states, including Massachusetts. So sometimes I used to ask a question in class. I'd say, how many of you think a 13-year-old can enter into a valid contract? Most people say, no, they can't. They're kids. Yes, they can. It's a voidable contract, meaning at its inception, it's totally valid regardless of the youth of one of the parties or both of the parties. But because we recognize there's certain vulnerability in being a minor, we want to protect them. And how do we protect them in contract law? We make their contracts voidable at their election, not at the adult. So I'm an adult. I'm dealing with a 14-year-old kid. Say I'm having a tag sale out in front of my house, and I've got an old BMX bicycle out there, and I got a $25 price tag on it. And the kid says, "I'll give you 20." I'm like, "Sure, kid, it's yours." Can that kid Has that kid entered a valid contract with me? Yes, but is there a right to disaffirm it? Yes, there is. They can repudiate the obligation of the contract, come back and get their money back. For how long? This is what shocks people. A minor has the ability to disaffirm a contract throughout the entirety of their minority status. So if that was a 14-year-old kid, they can disaffirm that contract right up until pretty much their 18th birthday. Some people say a short period afterwards to make it fair. I just use it as practical purposes at the 18th birthday. So, what will the kid do for the next 3, 4 years? Beat the hell out of that bicycle, ride it over ramps, damage it, let it sit out in the rain, get all rusty and basically worthless. Can they still now, after 4 years, get all of their money back from me, even though they have all this? I think those of you in accounting, I think it's called not diminution in value, but I can't even think of the term. It's just one of those mornings. But deterioration and depreciation. There it is, depreciation. I know some of you are accountants and you go over that kind of stuff. Can I get any of that? Because, hey, you've worn it down. I should get some value from the value exchange. No, the minor's entitled to all of their money back. What if the bicycle got destroyed? Believe it or not, in most jurisdictions, the minor is entitled to get their money back. Some of you are shocked and say this is really inappropriate. It's a very, very poorly considered rule. But when you think about it, who's got all the advantage? Anybody over the age of 18, anybody that has a basic education should know this concept. So what do? Instead of, if it's a bicycle, I'm not so worried about losing $50. But what if I was selling my car to a 16-and-a-half-year-old who had a valid license? Is that a valid contract? Yes, but what could that person do with my car? They could go out and beat it and blow the engine on it and get in accidents and everything else. Would they have the right to return it prior to their 18th birthday? Yes. Would I have to give them all their money back? Yes. So how would I avoid this? I don't sell to minors. I say, please bring a parent that I'll contract with. In fact, those of you, my kids are older now, but it seemed like forever, where I was watching, I don't have cable anymore, but I did for a while there, Nickelodeon, I think it was on, and I'd be watching SpongeBob, iCarly, Drake and Josh. I can't remember all these shows, but they were awful. Well, SpongeBob was pretty cool when it first came out. But there's ads, and who are the ads directed to? They're not directed to adults for the most part. They're directed to kids. But what does the ad almost always say in sort of quick speech, but in print as well at the end of the ad? Must be 18 years or older to order. Why are they doing that? They're not doing it because they have goodwill and they're responsible. They're doing it because they know the contract can be undone by the minor. This brings up another quick issue. Used to be company called EB Games. I think it got morphed or merged into GameStop. That's not doing so well now either. But my kids would often go there, especially after a series of cash gifts for whatever the holidays or their birthdays or something. And I couldn't stand being in there. The store was small and it was always crowded. Not anymore. Everything's downloaded directly from the internet. But back in the day, we'd go there and they'd have their own cash, or they'd have cash from me, whatever. And I don't want to be in there. So I'd say, hey, here's the money. You guys know what you want. I would stand outside the door and keep an eye on them. So, just to be a father, I guess. But I hated being in there. And my kids would sometimes buy the insurance on the games. I don't know if you can still do that, but the kids would say, hey, we got to make a decision within so much time or we don't have a right to return it. And I'd always laugh and say, well, actually you do. And my kid wouldn't understand what I was saying. He goes, yeah, up until your 18th birthday, even if you damaged that CD-ROM disc or the cartridge that went into their game, I don't know what they're called, Game Boys, or the small little handheld units, they had a right to return that right. Now, if I go back there and I say, hey, look, I'm an attorney, I represent my 12-year-old son here. He wants to return this Modern Warfare game that he paid $65 for. And because he's a minor, he has an absolute right to do it. What's the kid or the young person or even the manager of GameStop going to do? Get out of here, pal. No returns after so many days. We're not doing it. But if I sued, would I be successful? Yes. And I usually don't say this. It would be a slam dunk in my favor because minors' contracts are avoidable to disaffirmance right up into the 18th birthday. That shocks people, especially for bigger items like cars and expensive things. So what do you do when you're dealing with something that's a contract of significance to protect yourself as an adult? Ask the minor to come back with a guardian or parent or older sibling who is 18 or older, so you know you're going to end up into a binding contract that's not subject to disaffirmance. And for purpose of the test, don't be fooled on this. What if the minor buys something at 15, uses the item, damages it, parts of it are lost? Do they still have a right to a full refund of the contract monies that were given to the other party? Yes, they do. You guys can argue with me until you're red in the face, but it's actually the law. What's the reality though? Most minors don't know the law, so they're not going to ultimately do this. And most parents won't allow their children to benefit from such a rule when they know their children has actually used the product or damaged it themselves, or have recognized the fundamental unfairness of being able to return an item after a long delay like that. And so the practicality of this doesn't come up too often, but it can, and you should know about it. So minors' contracts are voidable. Now, once the minor turns 18, that's called ratification by silence. They basically, what was once jello or liquid and can be undone, now has turned into concrete. There is no ability to undo it based upon the principles of being a minority. They lacked capacity. Some contracts, the law said, hey, be careful. Sometimes we recognize minors do have to get into certain contractual obligations, and we should keep them enforceable. And those are contracts for necessities. It's usually not for the contract price. It's usually for the fair market value of the service or goods rendered. But for all practical purposes, it usually mirrors the contract. So think of the contract as enforceable when it comes to necessities. What's necessities? Food, clothing, shelter. Can't get out of paying rent. The 17-year-old might get a landlord-tenant thing, and the rent's due at the end of the year or end of 6 months, and the tenant says, hey, I'm only 17. I'm not paying. You can't enforce it against me. Yes, you could, because housing is deemed a necessity. Nowadays, there might be an argument that a cell phone might be a necessity. I don't know. I mean, it's not written in a statute anywhere what specifically necessity would be. It's a court-made principle that we're going to enforce minors' contracts for necessities. Medical care. Let me see what the list they have in the book. The reasonable value of clothing, food, shelter, courts, medical services, dental work, education through high school or trade school, even through college for someone, working tools for a trade, other goods that may be a luxury for some people are considered a necessity for others. I think now in modern day America, I think a cell phone might arguably be a necessity. I think you might argue a car might be a necessity if you're in a more rural community. In order to commute to school or work, it might be a necessity. I don't know. It's a jury question, really, what really amounts to a necessity and what doesn't. And the other big exception is minors' contracts for business dealings. What does that mean? Sometimes minors actually run a business. It's rare, but it happens. Especially, I always use landscaping as an example. Young person, 16 or 17, to get their license, they have a few mowers, they start hustling, they start entering contracts. Are those contracts enforceable related to them? Maybe they're buying some lawnmower blades or lawnmower parts or lawnmowers themselves, but they're not doing it just as a consumer. They're doing it in sort of this business entity. We create a legal fiction and we basically elevate them as an adult because they're entering into the world of business, and therefore those contracts are enforceable. Um, Looking at some other ones, medical care, I already mentioned that. And so it's disaffirmance. So what happens disaffirmance? You got a 15-year-old, they bought a really expensive bicycle, it costs $800. It's actually happened to my friend who's an attorney. His son did this, had to be 20 years ago now. Just saw his son the other day, like an older person. I remember when I was born, time's flying. But he bought a bicycle, and I always remember this story where I was with my friend, the attorney, and my quasi law partner. We'll talk about partnerships later. I'll use him as an example. He and I as an example. But his kid worked all summer long and saved up money for this bicycle, fancy bicycle, road mountain bike type thing. And he wanted to buy it from a bike shop in Sturbridge, and it was very overpriced in Sturbridge. The dad says, "Hey, we can get that bike for, it's $900 in the store in Sturbridge. I can get it next week for like $650 at the bike shop in Worcester." Because we're waiting a week. And so the the kid's dad and mom were divorced, but they lived literally within a few blocks of each other, and so they had this like shared custody situation. And that week, his son was staying with the mom, and we're riding in the car, and he's telling me the story. My son's dying at the bike, and all of a sudden he looks over and he sees this kid on the side of the road riding the bike. And my friend almost goes off the road. He goes, "Hey, there's my kid on the bike. He bought the bike. I'm going to kill him." And so he went home. A couple of days later, the kid's at home. He goes, "Hey, did you buy the bike? You did buy the bike, didn't you?" And he goes, "Yeah, I did, Dad. It's in the back." And just put it in the back of the car. We're going down to the bike shop and returning it. And the bike shop owner has a big sign: "All sales final." Points to the sign. Goes, "Hey, I'm sorry, pal. All sales are final. The bike was totally fit. There's no breach of warranty," which we'll talk about in later chapters. "Everything is fine with the bike. Your son bought it, and he's used the hell out of it. Look how dirty it is, covered with mud or scratches." He goes, "I'm not taking it back." And my friend, my partner, the lawyer, says, "Well, he's a minor and he has a right to disaffirm that contract, and he has a right to get all of his money back, regardless of how damaged it was." And the guy said, "No, no way." And he goes, "Well, I'm going to have to bring in a small claims, and I'm also sue you for my costs." And he goes, "Let me call my attorney." And the guy did. A guy called an attorney on the phone, who my partner knew and I knew too. And then you see the guy getting really angry on the phone. He comes back, he opens up the cash register, gives my friend his all of his money back, and takes the bike begrudgingly. And that's a good lesson to learn for a bike shop. What should they have done? Have your mom or dad come in and buy that bicycle, because that child could have disaffirmed that contract right up until the time he is 18. He's now 30 years old, I believe. Time flies. But anyways, that's a very important. So what do you have to do on disaffirmance? The minor has to return whatever goods or products he has, if he still has them, to the seller of the goods, regardless of condition. And the seller of the goods are allowed any value for the time it's used, or the wear and tear, or the depreciation, which I keep forgetting to say that word. And then ratification happens when you reach adulthood. If you've done nothing, your rights basically dissolve upon adulthood. Sometimes it's called ratified by silence. Okay, makes sense. So how to deal safely with minors? That's easy. You deal with their adults. And minors torts, in the book here, minors are responsible for tortious behavior, negligent acts, intentional acts, but they're also responsible for lying about their age. If they're lying and saying, "Oh, I'm 18, I really am," maybe they don't have a fake ID, but they convince the seller of the goods that they lied. Well, that's a tort. Lying is a tort. It's a fraud, and therefore they're held to the adult standard. That's kind of common sense. It's a book. The next part of the book talks about mentally impaired people, mentally incompetent. It's related to being a minor. Now, most people, I shouldn't say most, many people with mental incompetency flow in and out of lucidness. There's times they're well and there are times they're not. The law presumes that we're all mentally competent. So it's up to the party saying, when I bought that good, I was insane or I was mentally incompetent. It's up to me to prove it. And I have to bring in medical doctors and things like that. It's a very heavy burden. It's difficult to prove because we're presumed to be sane. And sometimes we know when we see someone that they have diminished capacity, we shouldn't contract with them. We should contract with their guardian, their ward, or their parent, and things of that nature. But the person that has mental incompetence, if it can be established they are mentally incompetent, that they don't understand the nature of the obligation they're entering into, they have a right to disaffirm the contract. Now, careful. What if it's somebody was going to say like me, but I don't I don't have mental illness like this. But some people have mental illness where they're well sometimes and they're competent and they're sound, and there's other times where they're not competent and not well. What if they entered into a contract during a period of incompetence? When can they disaffirm it? Well, they can disaffirm it, or somebody on their behalf can disaffirm it anytime they're mentally incapable of understanding the nature of the obligation they enter into. But what if they go into a period of wellness? They have to act on their rights. So if I'm insane today or incompetent today and I buy a watch from you, and the next day I either get on meds or a period of wellness just strikes me, and I realize now I bought a watch and I'm mentally sound, but I wear the watch and I enjoy it, what have I just done? I've ratified the obligation I've entered into, and I've lost the ability to disaffirm it. So you have to act reasonably quickly on a right to disaffirm if you enter into a period of wellness. Again, you have to be very much in a very deteriorated mental health state in order to use this basically defense of insanity. It's a very rarely invoked one in contract law. The other one's intoxicated people. A lot of people like to talk about this a lot. And I put a test question on that a lot of people get wrong. If you consume so much alcohol or drugs that you lose your ability to freely and voluntarily enter into a contract competently, the contract is subject to disaffirmance. It's avoidable contract. The problem with that is, one is courts don't like it, juries don't like to hear, oh, I got so drunk I wouldn't have bought the car otherwise, but my state of intoxication. Careful. Some people are intoxicated, but they're still what? They still knew what they were doing. They still have responsibility because they didn't truly lose their free volition to act in the way they did. And I don't drink like I used to, but when I was younger, I drank, and I'm not one of those people. Every time I drank too much, I remember exactly what I did, and that's called what in the morning? It's called embarrassment, right? Like, oh, I can't believe I said that to that person. I can't believe I was telling those jokes or those stories. I can't believe I was dancing like that. Obviously, I was competent. Why? Because I knew what I was doing. I obviously remembered what I was doing. The alcohol may have freed up some inhibitions to behave that way, but that doesn't mean I was incompetent. The type of intoxication has to be to the degree that you're really kind of blacked out to mental understanding of the moments. Again, the courts don't tend to like it. Juries don't tend to like it. It's a very rare condition, the mental incompetence one. The other one, in terms of mental diminished capacity because of a congenital problem that's becoming much more significant for people developing Alzheimer's and other memory capacity. In fact, I've won several criminal cases in the last year over that, where my clients allegedly did criminal acts and they didn't know where they were or who they were or what they were doing at the time, and they looked totally, for lack of a better way of saying, normal until I start talking to them, and I think they're being facetious with me because of the way they're answering questions. And I realize there's something wrong, and I have medical examiners look into their mental well-being, and they don't have the capacity to be criminally responsible, the same as if they were entering a contract. But don't get too excited about the intoxicated people. It's a rare situation where you're that intoxicated under well, I guess under hallucinant drugs, you might not be competent, but it's pretty rare. I go back to that same attorney, my partner. One time we were out together. We like to be responsible. And back in our drinking heydays, we actually rented we had a driver. We rented a limousine. A bunch of attorneys went out, and he drank so much he at one point had me in a headlock. I don't know if you guys know what a headlock is, but he basically has his arm around my neck, and he's ramming my head into the back of another motor vehicle, causing broke a taillight on a friend's car in the parking lot. I didn't drink that much. I remember every moment of it, and I didn't want to like fight back because he seemed like he was really. Well, it seemed like he was really insane, incompetent. In fact, he did not remember doing it the next day, and he thought I was teasing him that I would never do such a thing, Jim. Nothing ever like that ever happened. About a month later, we're at another event with a bunch of attorneys, and the attorney goes, "Oh my God, Mike, you had Corman in a headlock, and you're jamming his head against that car. I thought that was the funniest thing I ever saw. You were wild." And my buddy Mike still doesn't believe it happened, and he thinks I made up this whole story to make him feel bad. He would have been intoxicated to the point where he could not validly enter into a contract. But again, it's not very well liked in the law. We don't like people that voluntarily take drugs or alcohol and then try to benefit from it for their bad acts. So not usually very well. The book comes up in here, and it talks about convicts. The only convicts we're worried about here are those that are currently in an incarcerated status. The book suggests that once you're a convict, you've been convicted of a certain crime, you're no longer eligible to enter into a valid contract. Let's hope we never have a society that does that, because I think even the most conservative of us want people after they're done doing their jail sentence to go out and become employed. That's a contract. To buy goods, that's a contract. To rent a home or buy a home, those are contracts. And so the book makes it sound like anytime you've been convicted of crime, there's no longer the ability to be competent in a contract. That's totally invalid. There may be some argument in some jurisdictions that while you're in the incarcerated status, if you have one, you may lose the ability to enter into a valid contract. Pretty straightforward chapter, but huge ramifications. And mostly what's the main focus we have? People who are under the age of 18. They can enter into a valid contract, but valid but voidable until their 18th birthday, usually, even if they damaged or lost the goods. I hope the chapter was somewhat clear. I think it's clear. And otherwise, have a good day. Ask questions, raise issues, and be well.